627, and I'm selling a lot of stuff, and I'm selling my new Stan Lee biography, which is actually not due out till Tuesday, but I have advanced copies, and I brought a couple to sell here if anybody so desires. But it's the first comprehensive biography of Stan since his passing just about a year ago, but I've been working on it for close to 10 years, so anyway. But that's me. I don't think this is 5, is it?
It's close.
2 yet?
It's close, but
So I mean, I didn't see, Rubenstein did not seem to be at his story wall, I didn't see anybody else.
okay. Well, I know, so Mike Zach's not gonna be here, he's not feeling well. We have Joe St. Pierre, Joe Rubenstein, and Rick Leonardi that are supposed to be coming up. But I mean, I imagine we can start talking, right? Would that be rude to?
No, we have a full house here.
All right.
These are the bonus tracks you get here in these first few minutes.
So, well, maybe let's talk about your book a little bit. I know that you. I know that you were talking about talking about the creation of Spider-Man in that book between Stan Lee and Steve Ditko. And
Well, the origin stories of the characters, they were created in the early 60s, most of them by Kirby and Lee, and Spider-Man and Doctor Strange by Ditko and Lee, and this is the stuff of myth itself, like who did what and who came up with which part of the idea. And I don't know if any of you are on the internet, maybe you've heard of it, but occasionally there are disagreements in those forums about who did what, and it almost becomes as fantastic in people's imaginations and people's memories, even memories of things that happened before they were born, that sort of to try to figure out who did what, when, and why. So I try, and Stan, of course, I guess to most of the world, Stan is that lovable old guy you see in the cameos, and that was a large part of Stan, but Stan was also a creative force. He was a writer, he was a creative editor, and he was also a guy who survived in the cutthroat world of comics, movies, and TV for 75 years. So he had a lot of different aspects and a lot of kind of opinions he had about the things he did and opinions other people had about that. So I try to, I don't know if there's any setting the record straight, but I try to give a balanced view of who did what and what Stan's contributions were exactly compared to those of his creative collaborators, and so that's kind of so specifically the origin of Spider-Man is shrouded in in 100 different conflicting tales, whereas we know even the idea that somewhere in the creative vibe and ozone between Lee and Ditko's Spider-Man appeared, well then there's also there was a spider-oriented character that Joe Simon and Jack Kirby came up with like 20 or 30 years earlier, and was that influential? I tend to think that as soon as Batman came out and as soon as superheroes started, or thousands of years ago when mythology started, you would just take any creature or insect or water bottle man or cell phone woman, or I think in order I just think those were naturals, but there are people, there's all these claims, and then there was a Ben Cooper company costume that you see sometimes online that looked like the Spider-Man costume, and some people think, oh, they must have seen the Ben Cooper thing. I have a quote in my book, actually, from some guy named Bob Dylan. Maybe you heard of him. It's one of my other pet obsessions. And in his Nobel Prize speech, he says something like, everybody who went to public school in the United States was exposed to like pretty much the same curriculum, read the same books, and learned the same history and mythology, and so I think that was true of Stan and Jack and Stan and Steve. They had, they didn't go to college. But they went to good high schools. They had pretty solid educations and groundings in mythology and history, and they, and they all, they all lived in an era where they saw the same movies and heard the same fairy tales and pulp magazines. So it all comes out of this. There are a dozen Spider characters. What made Spider-Man and what makes Spider-Man important, I think, is as cool as the suit looks. There's at least a bunch of Spider people. There's Ben Reilly Spider-Man. As cool as the costume is, the idea of who Peter Parker is. Spider-Man always comes back to who the character is and why we sympathize with him, and what's human and contradictory, and that he's at heart a good guy, who tries his best, and still screws up, both the Spider-Man and Peter Parker. So we've got a lot of, so I think that as much as, of course it's cool that he sticks to walls and, spins webs any size, and is he strong? Listen, but he's got radioactive blood. All that stuff is cool. But it's the essence of who Peter Parker is that makes the character. And I think that character somehow was this kind of magical combination of Stan Lee and Steve Ditko's lives and personalities.
So I've seen Stan Lee generally get like 100% of the creative credit for Spider-Man, but that's not the case, right? Ditko was at least 50% responsible.
I mean, when you say you've seen it, where have you seen Stan Lee get?
Even in interviews where he's even said it's like more than 50%, or like I thought the writer was responsible for coming up with the ideas and
Stan said 100 different things. Steve said a lot of different things.
So did their relationship become contentious over how much fame and fortune Stan Lee got off us while Ditko kind of ended up in a ton of stew?
Well, Ditko claimed, and I see no reason to doubt what he said, was that the publisher, Martin Goodman, had promised him that if Spider-Man became successful, he would somehow be cut in with a bonus or royalties, or it always seemed vague, and that Goodman had never come through with it. That would not shock me. But something happened with him and Stan where they literally stopped speaking after Ditko left issue 38, so that was, but for that last year or two, he and Stan were not speaking. Stan said it was because Ditko stopped speaking to him, and Ditko said it was because Stan stopped speaking to him. I was a witness years later to, in the 90s, when Stan and Steve had a meeting about working on a project that later became Ravage 2099. So Steve came in for the meeting. They seemed very, I remember, there's all sorts of accounts of this particular day when they came in for this meeting at Marvel in the early 90s. And I saw what turned out to be, I think they had met in the morning, taken a break for lunch. So I saw Ditko come into the office and walk down the hall and walk into an office where Stan was sitting, and I could see Stan's face, and it lit up like he was seeing his long-lost best friend. And I have accounts in the book where Stan would say to people who, were maybe in junior high school in the 60s, Steve left. And I mean, and Steve would always say, Stan knows why I left, and, he knows full well. And, I don't know, I just think, they always say that, like, the most unreliable person at like a trial is an eyewitness, or the person to whom the thing happened, because very often our memories get so mixed up and we embellish them, or somebody else tells us something that they think happened. These guys were, don't forget, professional storytellers. Their jobs and their obsession, their jobs and their compulsions was to make stuff up and tell stories, and whatever was made for the more interesting, exciting story, that might even be the story they convinced themselves was true. So I mean, again, in the book, I try to give all these different versions. I think the fact is that the people who weren't in the room, are the only ones who know, and they may not even know. Somehow Stan wanted to come up with a teenage character that was not just a typical sort of dopey teenager, that it wasn't Archie Andrews, that was more like a real teen. Ditko had whatever his particular agenda. I think the idea of an adolescent character appealed to both of them, as a spider powers somewhere. This is again in the midst of time. Stan claimed that he had come up with the idea for the spider character. I don't recall Ditko ever saying that he brought that to the table. This gets into the weeds, and if you want to know that kind of details in there. But as far as Stan would sometimes take full credit for creating it, especially after Ditko left. I think he felt he had no moral obligation to promote a guy who would, as far as he saw it, walked out on him. I think also, you're thinking back to the 60s, 70s, 80s, even now, if a reporter comes, Stan was working in the office, he obviously was a big personality, he liked engaging with the public. And I think even if Stan said, Steve Ditko and I created Spider-Man, I think a lot of editors at general interest magazines, that was too complicated for them. It's like saying, Walt Disney created Mickey Mouse. Well, Walt Disney didn't create Mickey Mouse. But everybody, the easiest thing to say is, Walt Disney created Mickey Mouse and Donald Duck, even though Walt had all sorts of people working with him. I just think it's generally, to this day, considered too complicated. George Lucas created Star Wars. Well, he had help from a few actors and set designers and cinematographers. So yes, Stan either did that sometimes, or even if he tried to give credit, the people he was trying to tell it to didn't think that was a story they could provide to the readers. But he was all over the map with this, truly.
So let's shift gears a little bit and talk about.
Let's talk to the other guy.
We'll find out what they disagree with.
Apparently, the spotlight on me.
But I know you.
It has nothing to do with those pills I slipped in everybody's coffee.
Danny has at least a 45-minute worth of material from us.
Yeah, but I left most of it. I only brought 15 minutes worth with me.
So when I think of Spider-Man a lot, I think about Spider-Man being kind of like that everyman, that when readers read him, they actually can become that character. When that mask goes on, he really could be anybody, black, brown, white. And I think that a lot of readers identify with, better male, female, and a lot of readers, I think, identify with that. So can you kind of explain what makes a good Spider-Man story?
Well, a good Spider-Man story is a good Peter Parker story. Right? It always comes down to him being the regular guy superhero. That. I was telling you, I guess, this anecdote. I consider two of the top Spider-Man, or three of the top, I guess, Stan, kind of Roger Stern, and Tom DeFalco, I think, are, three of the greatest Spider-Man writers. And Tom was my boss, and I also edited. Marvel had that weird incestuous thing where somebody be your boss 1 minute, then you'd be editing their stuff 5 minutes later. Then they'd be giving you a raise review, then you'd be telling them to go home and rewrite. It was somehow it worked. So I said to Tom one day, as he was the editor-in-chief and I was the group editor of Spider-Man, which at one point was like 17 to 20 different Spider-Man related titles a month. And I said to Tom, sometimes Peter Parker says he's Spider-Man because, he let Uncle Ben be murdered, and so he feels that with great power there must also come great responsibility. Sometimes he says he does it to help Aunt May pay her rent and the bills. Sometimes he says he does it because it's fun. Sometimes he says he does it, because it's, it's unpleasant being Peter Parker. He's got 100 different reasons for being Spider-Man. Which is it really? And Tom said, he doesn't have a clue. He's just like us, obviously people have different motivations and different rationalizations and different goals. But a lot of things we do as humans, we do, and then we come up with the reason we did it afterwards. What's that? There's a Mike Tyson quote. Something like, everybody's got a plan until they get punched in the face.
It's a good quote.
Yeah, so I think that's what makes, Peter relatable, is that he's always trying to do the right thing, but even screws up and hurts people he doesn't want to hurt, and says the wrong thing. Ultimately, even when he wins, which he usually does, because he's a superhero comic after all, there's still something that he loses. For everything he gains, there's something he loses. For every battle he wins, there's some person he alienates. So I think in that way, people relate to him. As I was saying to Bud yesterday, kind of, even from the earliest days, if you remember Spider-Man playing pranks on Jonah Jameson, like webbing him to the ceiling, and I said, power and responsibility, nowhere in that equation does that include webbing Jonah Jameson to the ceiling. But, so in that way, Spidey even has a little bit of a mean streak too, And the funny thing is that he always had a girlfriend, maybe the first few issues, Peter was a loner, that's flab on?
No, please.
Okay, yeah.
That was one of my questions. I was going to ask the panel between Mary Jane and Gwen Stacy. What happened?
Oh, well, let me
You
back up a little.
yeah, back up.
Okay. I think, because it's funny, between Mary Jane and Gwen Stacy, because, again, you think of Peter Parker, Stan always used to say he had to deal with acne and the flu. Peter never had acne, but Stan was a good soundbite to talk about Peter having acne. But say maybe even in the first issue, if you guys go back that far, the first Spider-Man movie, the kids who hang out with Peter Parker in his class, they make fun of him and they ridicule him and maybe they play tricks on him, but they don't ostracize him. Somehow, he's the weird guy in the group, but he's in the group. That's a big difference. There's somehow, it may not be the healthiest relationship he had with his high school buddies, but he was one of that group. And there's even an early issue, and I know they kind of make, obviously when they wrote and drew these stories 60 years ago, I don't think they were imagining that we'd be sitting in this room talking. This guy's trying to make a deadline and get paid that week. But when early on, Peter asked Liz Allen, who was Flash Thompson's girlfriend, on a date, and she says yes. And then, of course, he doesn't make the date because he had to do, save the world as Spider-Man. But she didn't put him off or make an excuse. She actually goes, yeah, okay. And so all through those stories, he has a life. Jim Shooter, I'm going to paraphrase something Shooter used to say in explaining kind of, the term he used was nerd. I know nerd has taken on a more empowered meaning now. But I think he used to define a nerd, he said, it's someone who says to themselves, I'd have more friends if only my mother didn't dress me so funny. The idea being he doesn't realize that maybe his mother shouldn't be dressing him at all. So I think Peter always dressed himself.
Right.
Anyway, so
Oh, you were gonna go with Gwen
Gwen,
Stacy and Mary Jane, and then, so you were the editor when Mary Jane and Peter got married, but I mean, you came in.
I was the editor when they got engaged. I think I'd gone for, I was the editor 2 separate times, but I was certainly involved.
So what was the decision there as far as having them get married? Because then that kind of aged Peter out of being a young adult, right?
The decision was, as far as I remember and what I've heard, there was a convention in Chicago. Peter and Mary Jane had broken up. They'd been together and broken up. Just Betty and Veronica. Gwen had, had the unfortunate circumstance of being killed by the Green Goblin, which, there's a lot of different stories about who was responsible for that. And Peter and Mary Jane had dated and broken up. They had this very tortured relationship, and they were at a phase where they really weren't together. Mary Jane had revealed to Spider-Man, to Peter Parker, that she had figured out that he was Spider-Man. That was a great thing that Tom, DeFalco, and Ron Friends did, with, of course, my brilliant editorial approval. And that she really, kind of, instead of bonding them, kind of split them up. And I think eventually we would have gotten back together. But there was a convention in Chicago, like in '86, and I think Stan had decided that in the Spider-Man newspaper comic strips tended to emulate real-time passing more than comic books did. Not all of them, obviously the Peanuts kids didn't really grow very much, 60 but still 2.5 feet tall. But say the Dagwood characters or Dick Tracy, their lives seem to move on. And I guess Stan wanted to do that, and and especially Milton Caniff, where everybody idolized. So there was death and development. So somehow Stan decided he was going to have Peter and Mary Jane get married in the newspaper strip, and he announced this at a panel in Chicago that Jim Shooter was on. And I don't know if Stan said it or one of the audience members said, well, how about getting Spider-Man married in the comics too? And Jim said, okay, let's do that, and maybe, and he followed up on it, and they actually did it. Again, I'm not sure who pressed them to do it, but it ended up, I think it was probably an editorial decision between Stan and Jim that the characters should be. There were no Spider-Man movies or TV shows. This was the Spider-Man Bible. So the characters should match up. If he's married in one version, he should be married in the other. Because if you read the comics, Mary Jane has been away for a while, and then she suddenly shows up, and she's back, and they suddenly decide to get married, so that they can get married at the same time in the newspaper strip and the comic, which kind of made sense. Then you have a public relations event, and then you have the ultimate public relations event where Stan flies in from LA and officiates over the wedding of actors dressed like Spider-Man and Mary Jane at Shea Stadium before a Mets game, before a sold-out crowd. So it was definitely kind of shoehorned in. I mean, it was a natural. And then it was, so Spider-Man's a married guy, which actually leads to the Clone Saga.
Oh, no.
Well, it does. Shall I just go on, or do you want to actually?
Hey, I didn't have any questions about the Clone Saga, but
this guy has an entire package of clones.
They're mostly blank.
Prove it.
And questions for the artist. Yeah, no, I mean, we could go to the Clone Saga if you want to.
Well, no,
Anybody want to hear about that?
Yeah.
Okay, let's go to the Clone Saga.
Who said yeah over here?
Little kid.
Were you born when the Clone Saga came? No, you couldn't.
No way.
He's a clone.
Well, there had been married superheroes before. I guess the Elongated Man in DC. Was there anybody else on that? As far as superheroes, there must have been a couple. Adam Strange and Alana, were they? But again, that's
Superman and Lois, but they got
not
married after.
Not till after. So Spider-Man gets married. Now, it actually, and then shortly after that, Todd McFarlane came on the book as the artist. And the book was selling great. I mean, it was not, that didn't seem, that Spider-Man was married to a supermodel and lived in a penthouse didn't seem to bother anybody that this regular guy superhero was suddenly living, like a 1%er or something. Although he still was going out on photography assignments. Because people always loved Spider-Man, but then sales started, I guess sales, and comics, they go up and down, so at one point they went down for a bit. And with characters like Superman, Spider-Man, Batman, the answer always is, to a problem like that, we're bringing the character back to his roots, whatever that means. You're not getting Steve Ditko or John Romita was still alive and drawing, but you're not getting Steve Ditko back, you're not getting Jack Kirby. But the idea is, you kind of try to peel down, what made this character popular? Well, he was a single young person, a teenager, early 20s, and that's why children and teenagers related to him. Oh, but he's got this wife now, so let's get them divorced. Well, Spider-Man is a divorced guy, is a little depressing, isn't it? And if he's married, you can't do a lot of dating. Because if he did, that really would make him that sympathetic, nice guy. Let's see. We could kill her and then make him a widower. Oh, that would be a lot of fun. What kid doesn't want to read a story about a guy mourning his dead wife? I know, let's have him make a pact with the devil to undo the marriage. Oh wait, that happened later. But that is sort of where, one of the things the Clone Saga came out of was how do we take a married, prosperous Peter Parker, bring him back to basics without divorcing him, killing him, or having him have a lot of extramarital affairs, none of which would make him that sympathetic a guy. And so we thought, ooh, and I believe this was the technical term, something like, ooh, what if it was Terry Cavanaugh, who was one of the Spider-Man writers, and he and Howard Mackey convinced all the rest of us, said, what if, when that clone thing happened 20 years ago, there was a switch? Because Spider-Man, those of you who read those original stories know, he had the, right? You read those stories, right? Scott, you read those stories, right? Yeah, you know. Scott is a graduate of the Danny Fingeroth School of Writing, by the way. He paid money to have me teach him to write. He was a terrific writer, great guy. So, and the second generation Scott is here. So Spider-Man, so we figured, okay, let's say that story where Spider-Man refused to look at the results because he knew he was him. Well, what if he was wrong? Now, of course, with a real clone, I used our clone, and all he had to do was check like his navel, and he didn't have one, or any fillings or scars he might have. Okay, it was a comic book, so what if that person who had that intuition, that so sure that he was the real Peter Parker, turned out not to be, and the guy who had been the clone, instead of dying in the battle with the that was a pretty grisly thing, right? The clone dies in the battle with the Jackal, and then what does compassionate, loving Peter Parker do with the body? He throws it down a smokestack, burned in a factory. That was lovely. Yeah, anyway, it seemed like a good idea at the time, so he was still upset about Gwen's death. So that was the premise. And then this guy had not, so the clone had not died and had not been cremated in the smokestack. He had left New York deciding that he, was sort of a second best Spider-Man, and he gets on a motorcycle and he becomes like a barnstorming adventurer and has adventures. So here are two things that happen. So then you get, so the real Spider-Man is now back, having been on those adventures and realizing he's the real guy. He takes the place of Spider-Man. I'm confused just talking about this myself. The clone is back. I'm sorry, the real guy is back, takes over the life, and then Peter Parker goes off, and they do genetic testing, and it turns out that the one who thought he was the clone was the real Spider-Man, and all those adventures you saw for the past 20 years were happening to the clone, which we knew would piss people off. But what you have is a single unmarried Spider-Man, plus you have a dozen ideas for miniseries of the untold years, and that's true. But you're back, you do that story, you do it quick, and here's Spider-Man. He was never the one who got married. He's back to being Peter Parker, and we'll piss a lot of people off, which means we might sell a lot of comics, because our job as comic editors and writers is to make you angry enough that you will have to come back every issue to see how bad they were screwing up your character. I can't believe it! Because if we don't do stuff like that, then you'll just go, oh, I don't have to buy Spider-Man this month, because it's the same as Spider-Man last month. And you do that. There are comics or shows that you go, well, I know nothing's going to change, nothing's going to happen differently. So that was all this thinking that went in. We knew we pissed people off, we were hoping we would do it just enough to raise sales, and it worked. And then there was that whole thing when we discovered the one with the other, and the other one. At that point, Marvel had gone through like a corporate upheaval, and I was on my way out the door to take a job somewhere else. But that resulted from marrying Spider-Man and then thinking the reason the sales might have been going down was because he was no longer single. Even though, of course, need I say that Marvel never actually conducted any demographic studies to see if that was actually the reason. Because that would have actually cost money.
So let me switch gears and go artistically for you for a bit, because since we don't have any artists up here, that was going to be one of my questions for these guys. But I'll ask you, because you were in charge of hiring the artists
and firing,
which you did several times. So I have a co-host on my No Prize podcast, Johnny the Machine Hughes, and he lives in England. But he always says on my podcast, a panel drawn with Spidey's feet on the ground is a waste of space. So, how do the artists make sure that he remains dynamic in the air and in motion?
Well,
it always looks like he's very kinetic.
I get what he's saying. However, and he's mostly right, but let's say Spider-Man just found out that like his best friend died. Well, you don't want him. Then you want Spidey trudging down the hall like anybody else. Then it kind of looks silly for Spidey to be walking on the ceiling going, I feel so bad that my best friend died, Then you want Spidey, that's when you want Peter Parker. That's when you want to see this Peter Parker in a costume. But generally, yes, since he can leap, 30 yards with no effort, since he can climb on walls, since he has a spider sense, so nobody can sneak up on him, etc. There are some artists who get it. And I guess you work with an artist as an editor or a writer, and you get to understand what each artist is capable of. So I can think of some really terrific artists who you don't say to them, Spider-Man walks on the wall, or Spider-Man waves across the crowd, will just draw him, walking across the crowd like you or I would. And many artists you don't. Ron Francis you don't have to, Todd McFarlane, But there are some people who are very. So that's kind of partly again where the Marvel plot first, method comes in. That some artists thrive on that. If you tell whoever, John Byrne, Ron Francis, you can say to them, here's a fight scene, and in the course of it, we want to, have Aunt May is threatened, so Spidey has to protect her, but make sure that the ceiling doesn't fall on her, and at the end, we want to end up with Spidey springing his ankle and in great pain, and so the villain runs off and they pain, whatever that. You know, for some artists, you can just say that's what we want, and they can draw a 3-page sequence. Other artists, you know, might need a panel by panel breakdown of what that is, and that's, you know, that's why it's good to have regular teams working together, so the creators get to know each other. Because why would you tell John Byrne, for instance, or Ron Friends, what to put in every panel when you know? You know, as long as you give them the basic idea of what the scene needs to accomplish, they'll accomplish it way better than you could, in most cases, as an artist giving them panel by panel. They'll just feel restricted by that. You know, so, that answer would,
Yeah,
okay.
I'm happy with that.
Okay.
So I'm going to ask one more question, and then I'll open it up to the crowd because we have about 10 minutes left, and anybody that has questions. I want to talk about the black costume.
I apologize for not being Mike Zick, Joe Rubenstein, Joe St. Pierre, or Rick Leonardi.
Wow. That's fine. We'll find him. I'm going to find him. We're going to break some ankles later.
I understand he goes back to nobody coming together. And also, never, okay, that's another story. Anyway. Yeah.
So I want to ask about the black costume, because you were the editor on the Spider books,
Right.
when the black costume
I was,
debuted. And I just want to find out if we have someone with a black costume in the crowd.
Beautiful.
How did that change with the ability to tell stories? Did it change the kind of stories you could tell with a dark costume, like maybe a darker character, or more, actually kind of more sinister? Because I mean, this Lex who didn't turn into his greatest enemy, right?
Well, that, you know, it's funny that the way that started actually was somebody sent in some, you know, a fan, you know, slash artist, writer sent in an idea for a graphic novel where Spider-Man would wear a black costume, like a ninja or something like that. And apparently, whatever he sent in, it wasn't, you know, something that Marvel wanted to publish, but we liked the idea, especially Jim liked the idea of Spider-Man in like a black stealth costume. So they paid the guy like $500 or $1,000 just to buy that idea. And then it ended up being used in the secret, you know, as part of the first Secret Wars maxi series, and that whole premise was the characters would show up in their own monthly titles with something different about them, and then you'd have to buy the Secret Wars a story to see how we got the, you know, whatever change it was in Spider-Man with the black living costume.
And the toys, because Secret Wars was a huge marketing ploy.
It was astonishing, yeah. So Spider-Man comes back in Secret Wars. He's got the living suit, and he doesn't understand it. You know, he doesn't. You know, he just thinks, well, that's cool. He thinks because it came out of a machine. He thinks it's some kind of technological thing. He doesn't realize it's organic. So he's kind of having fun with it. And the idea really was that it was just a gimmick to get you to buy Secret Wars. So that maybe he'd have it for the black suit a couple of months. I think, you know, maybe 6 months tops. And we were really worried. You know, I think as fans are wont to do, you know, I'm sure all the letters and mail we got before the story came out was, I know it's going to be terrible. I haven't read it yet, but I know it's going to be terrible. What a rotten idea. And we were worried. You know, I mean, fans can have influence or be the tip of the iceberg of opinion. Which is why he got in and out of that suit originally so quickly. They discovered it was taking him over, and then Reed Richards helped him get out of it. That was a... And then the mail came in, and people were just nuts for that suit. You know, so then we had to get him back into it as an artificial one. We always knew that the suit itself, the symbiote, would be some kind of character. The specifics of Venom had not happened. I think when I was running the books, we were thinking of it more that, and we showed it a little bit, where it would take over different people. You know, it would just, that would be actually more of a menace to civilians, or I guess it would take over the Hulk or something like that. You know, I did a what if issue where one of Spider-Man's living suit, what if Spider-Man was taken over by his living suit, and it shows the suit going into Thor and the Hulk and the other characters. with Mark Bagley.
Which it has since actually done.
Well, you know, because it was a natural thing for it to do, you know, sort of, you know, that's in a certain way, a lot of the stories, you know, quote unquote, write themselves, and that if you set up situations with characters, with powers, with, you know, with subplots, they're almost things that you know, what doing genre comic books or genre fiction of any kind is about is giving your audience what they want, but not the way they want it, not the way they expect it, and yet to have it have an ending that when you go back and kind of trace it, you go, oh yeah, it couldn't have happened any other way. That's good genre, right? You kind of know Spider-Man is going to save the day because he's Spider-Man. You kind of know, you know. So we always knew that costume would somehow come back to literally haunt him. The Venom thing, I wasn't editing it then. I had mixed feelings about it, but obviously he's such a integral part of the Spider-Man universe now. You can't really say it didn't work. And every, you know, I mean, all of Spider-Man's best villains are versions of himself. You know, Dr. Octopus has 8 arms. Does Spider have 8 arms? Okay, good.
I don't think they're all arms.
You know, and so Venom is sort of a shadow, almost a mythological Campbell type, you know, shadow version of Spider-Man. You know, so a lot of his villains, you know, or any hero's villains are often some, you know, funhouse mirror version of themselves. And it was, you know, Todd drew the shit out of it with that crazy, you know, the musculature and the tongue, which makes no, you know, biological or it makes no sense at all. I mean, the Venom would always talk about eating brains, and I've never seen a universe handbook like the gesture chart of how Venom would actually eat brain, but it seemed like like a cool thing to say.
You're supposed to just go with it.
Exactly, and as one does. You know, so the living suit became, like I said, we knew it would be something, but it certainly became, you know, more. We never, so no one imagined there would be, you know, a living suit movie, you know, 30 years later and a sequel and all that.
So the last comment I'll make about the black suit is I thought Craven's Last Hunt, which is probably my favorite Spider-Man story ever written, when I think of it as, like, think of those 6 Mike Zeck covers that have him in the black costume. If you put the red and blue suit on him, it does not have the dramatic effect in that story at all. It needs to be black costume.
I mean, no, some of us wear black all the time.
All right, so maybe anybody need a question for Danny?
Yes.
So, I'm assuming everyone's played or heard of the Spider-Man video game that just came out last year, Spider-Man PS4.
Not me. I haven't.
No, you really haven't.
I really haven't.
So you just answered my question.
I'm totally not a gamer.
So I was just curious on if
about
you
the
got
dumbest-
contacted to help out with that video game at all, considering you were the developer.
So what was the question? So what?
Were you ever contacted at all for that video game?
Well, no, I haven't been to Spider-Man into it for 25 years, so it's on my.
So I was just curious if they went back, because the game was so good, I was curious if they went back to like source of it, sort of.
You know, I've been a consultant on the Marvel exhibition that's traveling around the country, so I can tell you about that. And, you know, I would say, you know, gaming-wise, I was just to riff off, having nothing to do with your question, I apologize.
No.
You know, but what was really interesting, and I guess it was the beginning of the video game phenomenon, or, you know, was when Maximum Carnage became a video game and an incredibly popular video. I mean, that was, you know, that nobody working on that had the slightest inkling about a game, or that it would be a game, or that it would, I mean, that was a shock to just, you know, that was like, boy, we need something to do to compete with all those big part multi-crossovers the X-Men and the DC books are doing. So let's do, that was, you know, that was basically from me, where in the sense that I came in and I said, you know, we have all these characters now. No, it's totally nothing to do with your question,
No.
sorry. But, you know, we have all these characters now, like Spider-Man and Captain America, who never kill anybody. And we have these characters like Venom, who somehow are considered, if not heroes, and anti-heroes, who kill everybody. And we got a bunch of people in the middle who once in a while, because I came from a generation with the comics code, where no superhero ever killed anybody, no matter how great the provocation was. So then maybe we should do some kind of story that kind of explores the good guys, the bad guys, and like the gray area middle, and that became, you know, oh, and let's try to exploit these symbiotes that everybody, you know. So that's how Maximum Carnage, you know, so I came in with that idea to a writer's meeting, and that was sort of how that came about, which has nothing to do with your question, but that's.
So interesting.
Okay, thanks. Yes.
You kind of answered half of my question before I got a chance to ask it. The Maximum Carnage series being 14 books long,
Yeah.
I had a paper route at the time, and I busted my ass every day to make sure I got my check, and I did my best to hunt down every one of those comics, and I still couldn't find 3 of them. The only 3 Spider-Man comic books I have never read prior to 2004, I read every single one before that. I actually owned all of them but those 3. Whose idea was it to make it jump from one title to another all over the place? I could not track them all down. I had subscriptions and everything.
Well, I mean, the way, I mean, it was mine, but I was ripping it off from other crossovers. And the idea was we wanted to introduce that quarterly, the Spider-Man Unlimited, and, you know, which was, so, you know, introduce the story, sell the story in issue 1 and end it in issue 2. I mean, at least according to the production schedule, you know, I think it was whatever the order of the books, that's the order of the chapters, you know, because they each had a different week of the month designated they would come out. So we tried to follow that. I guess we buy the comic shops or newspapers?
I had at least 5 or 6 subscriptions at the times to different titles, and my local comic shop I would go in 3 or 4 times a week.
That's weird.
Sometimes I would actually sneak over after school before I went home to do my paper out to try to see if they came in. And I think it was 9, 11, and 13. I could never find them. And I did get busted looking for 13 by my mom. I was grounded for a month.
Oh, you caught class.
Obviously, if you wanted those comics, you could find them in a back issue website or something. Did you ever get them?
Well, unfortunately, I stopped looking shortly after 2004 because I just got out of the military, and the 2 girls I was living with at the time wanted a friend to move in with them, so they told me either I left or they left, and to avoid being homeless, I had to sell my entire collection to get new ones. I got $1,000 for my entire collection.
Okay, well, they got the Maximum Carnage paperback, you should get it, you know, or just get it at Marvel on it. I'm sorry that happened. I had no real control of the distribution.
Yeah. I think I tried the Marvel Unlimited online or whatever, but like for some reason the borders are always cut off, so I stopped reading.
I don't know. I apologize to the younger you. You know.
So we have time for one more question.
During the Sony Disney debacle, there was like apparently Stanley's story said that Stanley wasn't happy with the way Sony was making Spider-Man. I don't know how true that was, but do you have any insight?
I've absolutely, all I know is what I read in the papers.
Okay. I just thought with the, you might have had some idea.
You know, all I can say is that in the aftermath of Stan's death, there's a lot of weird, you know, as you know, I mean, I covered it to some degree in the book. In the period leading up to his death and after his death, a lot of weird stuff happened. And so that kind of falls in that category of weird stuff that I probably shouldn't talk about without a lawyer's assistance. I mean, it was literally in all the papers. I mean, to try to keep up with all the different factions and things that happened or didn't. I mean, you know, so how these Disney, Sony rivalry is still on, or they came to a.
They came to an agreement. Yeah.
Shocking. Who would have thought?
I think everybody still wanted to make money.
Yeah.
I read more about like his attitude to how Sony was taking it.
You know, I'm guessing that Stan at that point had other concerns. You know, I think You know, and I think I don't want to speak for him, I just think he was 95, he had a lot of, health and issues, just wasn't, all that stuff. He died, I guess it was a year ago. I don't know if that was it was sort of a win-win for him, whoever won, it was still his characters and it goes in Kirby's that were being talked about. I get why he'd be curious. I just don't think that was his main agenda the last year of his life.
All right, so that's going to wrap it up. Thank you guys for attending this event.